Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Michael Regina. I am the author and illustrator of the graphic novel The Sleepover, which you can find anywhere books are sold throughout North America. And I'm here today to talk with you a little bit about why I make scary stories. Specifically, why do I make scary stories for kids? I figured it'd be fun to kind of go back through a look back on a memory lane of how I got into comics and making horror comics specifically, and the influences that sort of had the biggest impact on me when I was little, and talk a little bit about them. So let's dive right in and with the first thing. So obviously, if you've ever heard me talk about my own process or growing up, the biggest influence on me as a young kid is that movie right there, Jaws. I saw this movie when I was really young. It sort of kicked off this fascination I had with something scary and monsters and that sort of thing. And I saw this movie when I was like, I don't know, 2-3 years old. That's the earliest I can remember having seen it. And, what was so intriguing about Jaws as a little kid is, you see scary movies like with ghosts and with other kinds of monsters and this sort of thing. But what was so significant about Jaws to me was that this was like a scary movie about something that exists in our world that like I could go out and find, like great white sharks and this sort of thing. And I live in a coastal city in Jacksonville, so like I was constantly confronting this reality of sharks. And so I was seeing this movie that was really sort of scary and terrifying, but then I was also being forced to, or not forced, but I was coming into situations where I was constantly confronting sharks because I was out fishing. I really love fishing as an activity, and it really drove me to the water. And so I think there became this maybe thing early on in my head of like, I'm scared, but I'm intrigued by this thing that scares me and I love it, So Jaws was sort of that like initial catalyst. I saw it obviously way too young, but that's how that influence really started. Then a short time later, the second thing I can ever really kind of like remember getting pretty pumped up about, outside of like Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger and that sort of thing, was obviously a pretty big deal. It's a weird thing when you grew up in the 80s, we saw all sorts of stuff that like we never show our kids today, but for some reason we all got away with it. And Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street, all that stuff, I saw like all of it. But really one thing that stood out more to me around this time was the Alien franchise, the movie Aliens. Specifically Aliens, not Alien. I've seen Alien since and I love it, it's a classic, but Aliens came out when I would have been like 4 years old or so. And then it sort of made its way into television and the VHS, and it became this sort of like staple of the sleepover party with me and my friends as a kid. And if you've read The Sleepover, my graphic novel, the kids talk a lot about the movie Aliens, because for whatever reason, we just loved it. It was like this combination of scary and action and cool characters and jargon, lingo, and funny jokes and this sort of thing. And I think as a little kid, it showed me that horror could be something that is both scary and fun. And I've kind of internalized that a lot. I think of Aliens often as I'm working on books as this kind of perfect amalgam of scares and entertainment. The next thing that I remember really getting pumped up about was the Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine. These books came out when I was in the 5th grade, and up until this point, I wasn't really into like drawing scary comics or anything like that. I wasn't even like peripherally thinking about that. But I was getting into comics around the time the Goosebumps series came out, and getting into reading in general. I had just read my first novel ever going into 5th grade, and that was Jurassic Park. And the Goosebumps book came out at the same time. And so like my whole class, we just started buying these books up and really getting into them. And I bought like all the original ones, the original sets of books that were coming out when I was in 5th grade, and just devouring them. And there was something about that where it was like the first time I had actually seen horror that had been made for somebody my age, with me in mind. I actually have gotten the chance to meet R.L. Stine in person and have a lunch with him one day, which is maybe a story for a different video, but was so privileged to be able to sit across the table from him and say to him, you know, in person, man, you know, you're why I make scary books for kids. It was that very sort of young thing of like, oh, scary stuff can be made for kids. That was probably the moment that I realized it was a possibility as a little kid. Not that I could create it, but that it could exist, you know? And that was just as important for me at that age. Then if we kind of skip all the way ahead a little bit, let's go past like middle school, high school. During this period, I'm sort of really super into, I'm into scary movies and stuff like that, but a little less so. And then it's very specifically one thing sort of changed the game for me, and that was the movie The Sixth Sense by M. Night Shyamalan. I'm a huge M. Night Shyamalan fan. Like if you were to rank favorite directors, it's like, you know, it'd be guys like, you know, Spielberg and Alfred Hitchcock, and then like still above them would be M. Night Shyamalan for me personally. It's that seeing The Sixth Sense in the theater, and then Unbreakable. He sort of had this very early stretch where it was just like every single movie that came out was this sort of amazing like combination of scary, suspense, and meaning that really just like blew my mind. And then understanding that he was not only the writer, but he was also the director of them, that he was sort of the total voice package of that. I never really seen that before or thought much about it other than like Kevin Smith, which is, you know, a different voice for my generation at that time. But man, it's hard to understate like what that did for me. It sort of helped me realize at the time, like, oh, I can write and I can tell my own stories. I don't necessarily have to go and illustrate somebody else's story. It was the first moment I realized like I could write. And it was the first time I saw horror movies that were the kinds of stories I would like to write, if that makes sense. I wouldn't even necessarily call M. Night horror. I'd just call them like suspense thrillers with horror elements in there. But it was a breed of horror that I totally wanted to be a part of. And man, those movies have stayed with me ever since. So to this day, I will tell somebody straight up, the best time I've ever had in a movie theater was watching Signs on opening night in a movie theater full of like high school kids. I was like early in college at the time, and we were just going nuts. The whole movie theater was just going nuts and reacting to it and having a great time. And it was like, I just like knew like what I wanted to do sort of thing with that movie. It had that sort of impact on me. And then lastly, one of the things I would talk about is shortly after all this, I was listening to like interviews with M. Night Shyamalan and stuff, and he was talking about Rod Serling and The Twilight Zone. And even though I knew what The Twilight Zone was, I had never like watched it. And I ended up purchasing like a DVD box set of sort of like the greatest episodes of that show. And that was like my introduction to who I would still say to this day is my favorite writer, period, end of story, is Rod Serling. That sort of perfect blend of suspense and message and kind of moral. He creates these morality tales that are couched in something that's sort of terrifying and otherworldly. And those voices have sort of had, that voice has sort of like guided so much of how I write today. I think about my stories in terms of, I want to tell something that's scary and creepy, but I want it to be about something universal, a truth that is universal, that we can all wrap our arms around and understand and see ourselves in. And I think Rod Serling really paved the way for that for all of us who are interested in telling horror stories or just great storytelling in period in general. It's the best. Twilight Zone is the best. Best show ever made, period. Won't change my mind. So all that to say, why specifically horror for kids? Why do I make horror for kids? Well, for me, it's that the earliest things I can remember ever really being in love with were scary things. I know for a lot of kids, scary things are something they try to avoid. And I'm very aware that the books I make are not always going to be something for everybody. But for me, I always appreciated that sort of sense of scare and release and fun that can come along with a well-told scary story. And I think scary stories have such a great ability to talk about topics that are sometimes more difficult, such as things like the supernatural, the afterlife, all that, because it sort of naturally assumes that these things exist, whereas other genres may have to kind of convolute or work their way around there. It feels like such a fertile ground to talk about big philosophical things. But I also think that I enjoyed as a kid being a part of something that sort of felt even safely dangerous, you know? And so that's just always stuck with me. It's never gone away. That feeling of being spooked out and having fun with it anyway. And, you know, my aim as a storyteller and a graphic novelist is I want to create for kids the kinds of books that I wish I could go to the store as a kid and buy, something that is totally appropriate for me, but feels exciting and scary and funny and has something hopefully you can chew on afterwards. You know, I enjoy asking my kids like, hey, what was the sleepover about? And hearing what their answers are, because what I mean by that question isn't like what, I don't mean from that question like, what do you think the story was about? Like, what happens A, B to C? But what was the message of the story, and how did those things come together? I just think horror is such a great vehicle. Every genre is, but for me, that sense of scariness, supernatural, humor, fun is always been what's been my favorite thing to watch, and has continued to be my favorite thing to write. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was fun to sort of take you down memory lane, talking about the influences that I was into. If you've never read my book, The Sleepover, you can grab it, like I said, at pretty much any bookstore or online retailer that sells comics. And I'd love to hear what you think of it. And if you enjoyed this and would like to hear me talk more about my process or other influences and that sort of thing, I plan to start doing more videos more regularly. So hit that subscribe button and drop a like or whatever, and hopefully we'll be talking some more soon. Appreciate you guys. Hope you're having a great one, and talk with you soon.